Welcome back, dear viewers, and you are still watching our special coverage to the African-Russian summit currently taking place in the Russian city of Sochi with the attendance of President Abdel Fattah el-Sisi, and we are joined today by our dear guest, Mr. Mohsen Arishi, journalist. Good afternoon.
Good afternoon. Thank you for having me with you.
But before starting our interview with Mr. Arishi, we'll have this report on President Fattah el-Sisi's address to the first session of the Russia-Africa Summit early in the day. President Fattah el-Sisi confirmed on Thursday that African and Russian peoples share strong bonds, aspirations and challenges. Addressing the first general session of Russia-Africa Summit, the President said that these bonds prove the need to enhance the African-Russian cooperation. The President reiterated the need to support the African Union policy of reconstruction and development after settling conflicts and creating resilience to prevent the recurrence of conflicts and to strengthen the state's institutions to be able to protect their countries. El-Sisi said that combating terrorism is a priority for the international and African peace and security agenda, reaffirming that the battle is hard and complicated. He added that a comprehensive confrontation to terrorism is the best way to uproot it. President el-Sisi invited Russian President Vladimir Putin and African heads of states to participate in the first Aswan Forum for Peace and Sustainable Development to be held on the 11th and 12th of December 2019. He also called on them to take part in the forum's discussion to enrich the debate on the main issues. For his part, Putin said that Russia-Africa Summit is the start of a cooperation between the two sides. He noted that upgrading the level of economic trade and social cooperation is one of priorities to Russia. Putin said that President el-Sisi, as the current chairman of the African Union, played a key role in preparing for the Russia-Africa Summit. President el-Sisi and his Russian counterpart co-chaired the first general session of the Russia-Africa Summit being held in the city of Sochi. The Russian president expressed his concern over the state of instability in Africa, pointing to a number of internal conflicts as well as political, economic and social crises. Putin said that Africa is confronting terrorism, extremist ideologies, crossing border crimes and piracy, adding that some countries are facing the consequences of the so-called Arab Spring, which led to instability in North Africa. Welcome back. Mr. Mohsen, can you tell us more about the significance of this Russia-Africa Summit and President Fattah el-Sisi attending this summit as the chairman of the African Union?
Sorry. Actually, before elaborating the significance of this first edition of the African-Russian Summit, we should seek to shed more light on the two leaders who are now at the driving seat in Russia and in Egypt. I mean President Sisi and his Russian counterpart, President Putin. You know, there are striking similarities between these two leaders. Of course, President Sisi has strong relationship with many leaders of major powers, but concerning the Russian president, I mean President Putin, President Sisi and Putin have a special relationship because each of them came from, you know, Sisi was director of the military intelligence. In the meantime, Putin was the director of KGB, which is the Russian intelligence. And both men assumed presidency in their country, in their countries, when there was similar circumstances. Putin came to power, was elected president for the first time after the old Soviet Union crumbled down and was divided into several states. Some of them went to Europe, Western Europe, and others preferred to stay. President Sisi, in the same way, came to presidency in Egypt, when Egypt was almost on the brink of collapse, economically, politically, everything. So those two leaders in particular have the same or share goals,
Yes.
share ambitions, share the interests of their people, and they also have shared experience in fighting terrorism, which is the plague in the 21st century. So, you know, President Sisi, of course, after assuming the presidency, after Egypt assumed the presidency of the African Union, President Sisi did his best
Yes.
to renew Egypt's central role, to invite Russia again to Africa to have strong footholds here in the African continent.
Yes.
We all remember that it was Egypt which opened the gate of Africa to the old Soviet Union in the 1950s, but at that time the Soviet Union limited his supply of weapons and ammunition and military equipment to liberation movements in Africa which were struggling to gain independence from Western colonial regimes or rules, occupation I mean. Now, Egypt under President Sisi opened the door of Africa even wider
Yes.
than before to Russia to come. But
Yes.
this time, President Putin has a different agenda from what was going on in the 1950s and 1960s at the time. He is ready again. In the past, there was a war, liberation war. Now, in Africa, in different parts in Africa, there is an anti-terror war. And Russia has very good experience after fighting and defeating ISIS and other terrorist groups in Syria.
Yes.
So Russia now, I think, will give big boost to the anti-terror war in Africa by providing its military experience. It's of course in collaboration with Egypt, because in the meantime, and this is very significant by the way, Egypt also has possessed very good experience in fighting terrorism, and nations or countries which supply them with logistic assistance or
Yes.
financial help. Egypt and Russia now can do very good job in Africa concerning anti-terror war, which is very essential to establish stability and development, as President Sisi has always stressed that Egypt's vision
Yes.
under its presidency of African Union is stability and development and economic welfare to the African nations.
Also, sir, now we'll have a report to show us more about President Fattah Sisi's activities in Sochi, as he called on Russian and international firms to invest in Africa. Meanwhile, Russian president said his country is among the top 10 importers from Africa, but called for boosting of trade with the continent. Details in this report. President Fattah Sisi called on Russian and international firms to invest in Africa, stressing during the first ever Russia-Africa summit that this is the ideal time for economic openness to the continent. The president also urged regional and international funding bodies to back development efforts in the continent by offering special conditions and powerful incentives to projects and development programs there. The summit is co-chaired by President Sisi, who holds the rotating presidency of the 55-nation African Union, and Russian President Vladimir Putin. Speaking at the opening session in the seaside resort of Sochi, Sisi urged African leaders to work to improve business climate and promote private-public partnership in the region, and unite to achieve peace, stability, economic growth and development for its people. Russian President Vladimir Putin told the gathering that his country is among the top 10 importers from Africa, but called for further boosting of trade with the continent. Moscow says trade with African countries climbed to $20 billion in 2018. Russia is setting up a major industrial zone comprising 23 firms in a planned international industrial and logistics hub near Egypt's Suez Canal, and Putin says there are plans for more firms to join in the future. Putin said his country wants to invest $190 million in infrastructure development and attract up to $7 billion. Russian-Egyptian relations are developing very positively, with trade turnover growing 14% last year to reach $7.7 billion. The Russian leader said the United Arab Emirates is very interested in taking part in joint development plans between Cairo and Moscow in the production sector. President Sisi noted that African countries are putting infrastructure development and promoting economic integration at the forefront of joint cooperation. They also agree that human development is another key prerequisite for sustainable development in a continent where people under 25 years of age make up 65 of the 1.2 billion population. Welcome back, dear viewers, and we are still hosting Mr. Mohsen Arishi. He's a journalist. And Mr. Mohsen, first tell us why Russia now is showing interest in establishing more relations with African countries.
Yeah, this is a very good question. Of course, yes. Russia, through the old Soviet Union, has a historical relationship with the African nations and African countries. If we remember that, it was only the old Soviet Union which helped several dozens of African countries to obtain independence from colonial rule, yes. from Western European occupation. Old Soviet Union was everywhere. In Africa, providing weapons, providing military experts, and also equipment to African liberation movements in different countries in the continent to obtain. So it's not strange that President Putin wants to revive or to renew, to expand the relationship between his country and Africa. This is okay, but this time there are more challenges, different challenges. I mean, there are more opportunities to offer to the African countries. For example, most of the African countries are poor. Yes. Have poor economy. They cannot finance development projects. They cannot finance the war against terrorists, against jihadists in their country, like in Nigeria, in Burkina Faso, in different African countries. So African countries need investments, need financial help, need country major power, superpower, like Russia, to come and establish strong relationship in this anti-terror war, which is very essential again, and a prelude to increase, develop, or to launch development projects for yes. the African people.
Yes, Mr. Mohsen, also now we'll have a look on a report on Egyptian-Russian relations, as they are historic and were flourishing in 1950s and 1960s, but their roots extend much further. Details in this report. President Fattah al-Sisi's visit to Russia opens new important horizons in the course of mutual relations between the two countries and regional cooperation, whether on the issues of the Middle East or Russian cooperation with the African continent. This is the fifth visit of President Sisi to Russia since his first visit as Minister of Defense in 2014. This is also the 12th meeting between President al-Sisi and Vladimir Putin during this period. In addition to bilateral relations, the main topic of President Sisi's visit to Russia is the Russian-African Summit. The summit discusses many international issues and ways of deepening Russian-African cooperation in various fields, from politics to culture. The summit also focuses on many important economic issues of common interest, including energy infrastructure, mining, agriculture, and information technology. Russia is also seeking to strengthen cooperation with Africa in the fight against terrorism and extremism. Moreover, it seeks to find solutions to the problems nations of the African continent fight poverty and disease and work on technological progress. In terms of bilateral Egyptian-Russian relations, Russia is one of Egypt's largest trading partners. Trade exchange between Egypt and Russia has achieved remarkable growth in 2018, reaching $7.6 billion, while Egypt's exports to Russia increased by 4.1% in 2018 to reach $526.4 million compared to $505.6 million in 2017. This is due to the increase in Egyptian exports of agricultural crops as well as industrial commodities, especially pharmaceutical products and food and chemical industries. However, Egypt aspires to a greater increase in Egyptian exports to ease a large trade deficit between the two countries. On the economic side, the Russian Industrial Zone project in the Suez Canal Economic Zone is Russia's first offshore project. The Russian capital in the infrastructure projects of the project amounted to $190 million, while the expected investment is about $7 billion. Until now, about 55 Russian industrial companies have expressed their keenness in investing in this project, which will create about 150,000 jobs. In recent months, the two countries have agreed to finance and supply 1,300 railway wagons to develop the railway sector in Egypt and discuss joint manufacturing steps for these wagons, as well as ways of enhancing cooperation and coordination between Egypt and Russia in African markets. So, Mr. Mohsen Ab, as we just heard a report on the historical relations that bind Egypt with Russia. So can you tell us more information about these relations?
But first, there is something attracted my attention concerning what happened in the past between Egypt and old Soviet Union, and what is going on now between Egypt and Russia, of course, under Putin.
Yes.
You know, all of us know that in the past, in the 1950s, late President Gamal Abdel Nasser had the old Soviet Union next to him, to his side, when Gamal Abdel Nasser championed the support of African nations willing to obtain independence from European occupation. At that time, President Gamal Abdel Nasser gave the old Soviet Union a rare opportunity, unprecedented opportunity, to come to Africa to help Egypt launch development projects which culminated in the construction of the High Dam, and in the meantime to help African resistance movements in different African countries to obtain independence. Now it is the same. President Sisi, I said in the past, President Gamal Abdel Nasser championed a liberation war in Africa. This time, President Sisi is under of course, Egypt is president of African Union. So President Sisi declared that Egypt will champion development, stability in the African continent. I don't know by coincidence or this is the message of history.
Yes.
President Sisi has Russian leader to his side to carry out his ambitions to the African people. In the past, it was Gamal Abdel Nasser who invited the Soviet Union to help African people get rid of occupation.
Yes.
Now, in the 21st century, and this is very important, there is President Sisi of Egypt who invited Russia to help African, this time, develop for development projects for stability. So history repeats itself in Egypt, not anywhere else in other country. It is Egypt. It is our central role in Egypt. This is Egypt.
Yes.
Yes.
Also, President Fattah Sisi today held an important meeting with the Ethiopian Prime Minister, in which he said that his country has no intention to hurt Egypt's interests or the downstream countries, the Nile River, and that the latest comments were taken out of its context. So how do you see this positive meeting?
You know, paradoxically,
yes,
President Sisi when Egypt assumed presidency of African Union,
Yes.
said that Egypt is aiming at stability and security and development in Africa. In his speech in the UN about last month,
Yes.
President Sisi said that the cut or shortage of water to Egypt will destabilize not Egypt alone, will destabilize the continent, Africa. So I don't think, in my point of view, the Ethiopian Prime Minister, Abiy, will swim against the tide because major powers, whether United States of America or European countries or Russia, are calling for stability and development in Africa in particular, because this continent has been done injustices over decades, so many decades. So I don't think the Ethiopian Prime Minister will act differently, will himself try to destabilize Egypt and other African countries like Sudan, like Somalia, like Nigeria, because what happens in Egypt echoes, whether favorably or negatively, in different or across the African Union.
Yes.
When Egypt obtained its independence in the past, you
Yes.
know, many African Union collaborated with Egypt and also obtained their independence.
Yes.
Now Egypt, we already achieved stability, development after this chaos in January 2011.
Yes.
So we are exporting our ambitions to African countries.
Yes.
So the Ethiopian Prime Minister, in the end of the day, will bend to the will of the Egyptians and to the will of the international community.
Yes. President Abdel Fattah al-Sisi, dear viewers, held meeting with the South Sudanese president, and the president stressed Egypt's keenness to develop cooperation with South Sudan on multiple levels, especially in light of the importance and depth of relations between the two countries. More in this report. President Abdel Fattah al-Sisi stressed Egypt's keenness to develop cooperation with South Sudan on multiple levels, especially in light of the importance and depth of relations between the two brotherly countries. President al-Sisi remarks were made during his meeting with South Sudanese President Salva Kiir in Sochi on Wednesday on the sidelines of the Russia-Africa Summit, co-chaired by Russian President Vladimir Putin and the Egyptian President, who holds the chairmanship of the African Union for 2019. According to a statement by presidential spokesman Bassem Rodi, el-Sisi affirmed Egypt's continued support of the government and people of South Sudan and efforts aimed at achieving a final peaceful political settlement in Juba. The president highlighted Egypt's endeavors on the regional and international levels that aim at strengthening efforts to restore stability and security in South Sudan and improve economic conditions. Kiir expressed his country's eagerness to continue strengthening bilateral cooperation with Egypt in various fields in light of the fraternal and distinguished relations between the two countries. Kiir also praised the role of Egypt in supporting stability in the region and South Sudan. This comes within the framework of Egypt's leading role in the region, as well as Egypt's current presidency of the African Union and the historical ties between the two countries and peoples. President al-Sisi stated during the meeting that Egypt will continue to provide assistance and technical support to South Sudan, which will contribute to meeting the aspirations of its people for a better future and to move forward in the implementation of bilateral projects. Welcome back to Mr. Mohsen, and we are still talking about the Ethiopian Renaissance Dam, and the Prime Minister today said that the stability of Egypt and Ethiopia is an added value to the whole continent, also reiterating commitment that his country is sticking to the path of negotiations.
Yeah,
so how do you read his statement?
Yeah, this is okay. The Ethiopian Prime Minister acknowledged the central role of Egypt in the African continent and Egypt's influence, of course.
Yes.
I don't talk about anything politically or but economic, and in terms of economy, in terms of stability. And I think this morning Russian President Putin said that he is willing to intervene
Yes.
to narrow differences, and I don't think this is differences. It's about filling the Nahda Dam, Renaissance Dam, and I think everything will go. I don't have any concerns about negative attitude of Ethiopia towards Egypt, because Ethiopia knows very well what is Egypt in the country, and we are now the president of African Union.
Yes.
So I don't think Ethiopian Prime Minister will challenge or defy the president of the African Union.
Yes.
He will be blamed by all African countries, by international community.
So finally, in 1 minute, I would like to shed light on the first Aswan Forum for Peace and Sustainable Development, which will be held on the 11th and 12th of December 2019. And President Fattah Sisi invited the Russian President Vladimir Putin and other African leaders to come and attend this important Forum for Peace and Development in Aswan. So how do you see the importance of this forum?
This is the, value added.
Yes.
To the first Russian African summit. And President Sisi, I really want to express my admiration to such a leader, because he came to the presidency of Egypt in a very critical moment or juncture. So he invited this afternoon, I think,
Yes.
President Putin of Russia to attend this forum. So Egypt and Russia are accelerating the celebrations of new future and prosperous future in this continent.
Yes.
Africa will be something completely different under President Sisi and his friend Russian President Putin.
So finally, I'd like to thank you, Mr. Mohsen Arishi, journalist. Thank you for being with us today.
Thank you for having me with you.
And now, dear viewers, by that we come to the end of today's edition of Cairo Local Time. Stay tuned for our special coverage to the Russian-African Summit taking place in Sochi with the attendance of President Fattah Sisi.